In this presentation, we are going to use Google Earth to explore the beginnings of civilization in the Indian subcontinent. And of course, just to lay the groundwork, the broad time frame that we are dealing with begins from the end of the Ice Age, that is the last glacial maxima, which ended around 12,000 years ago, began to end around 12,000 years ago. And just after the end of the Ice Age, you had the Earth becoming more conducive for the development of agriculture. So you have, in a sense, a proliferation of agriculture-based sites. And these are small villages very early on after the end of the Ice Age. So let's just get a review of where agriculture was, in a sense, being incubated around the world. And then after getting this broad overview, we will start focusing on the spread of agriculture civilizations in India. So this, of course, is a corollary, in a sense, to the presentations that I have going on regarding the development of civilization and various forms of political order in Mesopotamia and Sumeria. So agriculture began very early on, around 9000 BC. And the first and the oldest site where we have found traces of agriculture is in Jericho in the Jordan River Valley. So Jericho dates back as far back as 9000 BC. So that is an 11,000-year-old site. And from Jericho, of course, around the center of Jericho, you had a proliferation of various settlements around this wider arc known as the Fertile Crescent. So beginning from the eastern coast of the Mediterranean up into the eastern reaches of the Anatolian Peninsula, and then down the Euphrates, down into Sumeria, which is of course the land of the two rivers. So there was a proliferation of settlements, which became, in a sense, the foundations of various civilizations that grew in this region. Of course, we have spoken about Eridu in presentations on the beginning of Sumerian civilization, and Eridu was founded around 7000 BC. So some millennia after the foundation of Jericho, but in terms of archaeological time, not very soon after. And Eridu, of course, became the center around which Mesopotamian civilization grew. And this is something I have discussed in the presentations on the Sumerian and Mesopotamian civilization. But there was a proliferation, like I said, of various settlements around this wider arc. This arc, which is of course known as the Fertile Crescent. These were the earlier Natufian cultures, which gradually grew into the Ubaid cultures. Around the Caspian Sea regions, you had various settlements, and various very old ones such as Sarab, Haji Firuz, and Jarmo. And then moving into the Iranian plateau, you had settlements such as Tepe Sialk, and then moving further south, Tepe Yahya, which is very close to the coast of the Persian Gulf. Of course, not all of these settlements were based on agriculture, but were themselves inhabited by people who still relied on foraging and hunting and gathering. But they played an important role in the development of a network of circulation and exchange in this wider region. So even very early on, across this entire arc, across all these regions, you find artifacts from different places, from different sites, across this wider arc from the Fertile Crescent to the Iranian plateau. So there was an old network of exchange and interchange, which included materials such as minerals and materials such as animals, domesticated animals, also some rare stones and shells, of course, shells from the Persian Gulf, which were shared very early on. And shells from the Persian Gulf, in fact, have been found as far north as the Iranian plateau and as far west as Jericho and the Jordan River Valley. So the overall impression that we get is that this was an era in which there was these experiments with agriculture-based civilization, and there were these networks of trade and circulation. So now, of course, we move to the Indian subcontinent. The Indian subcontinent has at its core a continental plate which is called Gondwana land. So this essentially is a continental plate that runs down from sort of north-central India down to Sri Lanka. So this is one ancient continental plate. And it struck into the Eurasian continental plate, creating the Himalayas, which sort of became a crease at the edge of the Eurasian landmass being pushed up as the Gondwana land struck into it. So the Himalayas continue to rise by a few centimeters every year. So the Gondwana land is continuing to push into the European landmass. And as it did so, it also created these fertile sort of zone which in a sense rose out of the ocean as Gondwana land struck into this Eurasian landmass. So this Indian subcontinent is a geographical unit. And when I talk about the development of Indian civilization, I am talking about civilization in this wider Indian subcontinent. Of course, the Indian subcontinent has various nation states today. So these are from the north. This is Afghanistan, parts of which was of course fall in the Indian subcontinent, and most of it is in this Eurasian sort of plate. And we will also talk about Iran, which interacts with this zone. Then of course there is Pakistan in the northwest. Then you have the Republic of India. We have Nepal in the Himalayas. We have Bhutan. We have Myanmar, and in the south we have Sri Lanka. So when I speak about Indian civilization or the development of civilization in India, I'm talking about the Indian subcontinent. So that is something to keep in mind as we go along. So moving forward with our story. So the oldest settlement that we have found so far, which is an agriculture-based settlement, is in a site known as Mehrgarh, which was founded around 7000 BC. So contemporary in a sense with Eridu. And Mehrgarh was founded here in a region of Pakistan. This is the Quetta Valley region of Pakistan, and in the sub-region known as the Kachi Plain. So you can see even here that the Kachi Plain is in a sense an island of green in the middle of this barren, rugged sort of region that you see all around. On the west, you have these creases of the Hindu Kush mountains, which is where Gondwana land is pushing into the Eurasian landmass and creating these high hills, and also creating the Iranian plateau. And of course, just to the south, you have this plain, which is the edge of the Gondwana landmass, which runs down. We move further down, runs into the Indus River. And the Indus River is, of course, creating this green zone. Now, the further back in time that we move, the more complicated things get in terms of the geography of the Indian subcontinent. So the northern Indian subcontinent has had a very volatile geography. Rivers have changed course, and mountains have sort of risen. And of course, even the coastlines have changed quite a lot, with water becoming sort of water was much deeper inside closer to the ice age. So this region of Gujarat that you see was a much narrower peninsula, and here this Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea was much further up inland. So a lot of things have changed since the time that Mehrgarh was founded, but the most important thing is that this region was a lot greener than it is today. It wasn't a very lush, tropical region, but it had pasture lands, and it had possibly people who were agro-pastoralists in a sense, who were people who kept sheep and sort of farmed, who came and settled at the site of Mehrgarh and built a village here. So why Mehrgarh? Mehrgarh, of course, first of all, there is fresh water here. There is water which flows down from the Bolan River. This is a rain-fed river, and it flows down through what is called the Bolan Pass, a pass of the same name. So water, of course, is the most important element for any civilization. So Mehrgarh was founded here for fresh water, but also the water of this river carried down flint from the rocky mountains, from the rocky highlands of the Hindu Kush. And flint was important for making tools in the late Stone Age, and people who settled here sort of mined this flint from the river. And while doing so, they possibly realized very early on there was another very important substance that was flowing down into the waters of the river, and this was copper. So while possibly mining flint, they also discovered copper and began to use copper for making tools and sort of kickstarting the copper age. So lots of important resources here. In addition to these minerals, there were also animals. So there were sheep, and there were buffaloes, there were cattle, there were pigs, and there were lots of wild animals such as gazelle, different sorts of deer, wild swamp deer. There was the nilgai, which is known as the blue bull. There was also the onager, which is a wild donkey, which was domesticated very early on and became, in a sense, a pack animal for doing a lot of work, also for pulling carts and so on. So this was, in a sense, an oasis in the middle of this wider region, which the mountains on one side and these pasture lands on the other. And in addition to everything else, the Bolan Pass. The Bolan Pass allowed for communication between people who lived in the Indus River Plains, which is this wider region. So there were people living here. There were people living across the Indian subcontinent since the Stone Age. And these people, of course, weren't farming, but the Indian subcontinent was, even in the Stone Age, a rather densely populated land, with people, of course, hunting and gathering, and of course, some people also domesticating animals here and there. So this was an important zone where people from the Indus Valley region moved upwards, and people from the Iran plateau moved downwards. So Mehrgarh, in a sense, became this strategic location or hub, which people interacted, people moving in from the west and people moving in from the east. And of course, people brought in ideas, and that is something that we will discuss in a moment. But not much after Mehrgarh was founded, so again speaking in terms of archaeological time, around 6000 BC, around 1000 miles to the east of Mehrgarh, was founded the settlement of Koldhiwa. And Koldhiwa is a settlement on the Ganges River, the Ganga River. And here too there was an experiment with agriculture very early on. In Mehrgarh, the first plant that was cultivated was barley, which was available in the wild, and people learned very early on that it could be cultivated and grown as a crop. In Koldhiwa, the crop that was grown was rice. And this is one of the first and the earliest places in which rice was cultivated, in addition to the Yellow River Valley in China. But the experiment with making an agriculture-based settlement was very short-lived in Koldhiwa. Of course, this settlement was located in what is a tropical zone, and very you can see that even now it is a very green place, in contrast to the surroundings of Mehrgarh. So possibly back-breaking work of agriculture was something that people learned very early on. Wasn't worth the effort, in a sense, when you could just sort of get all your nutrition by hunting animals or by sort of foraging, by planting trees perhaps, or cultivating trees or getting fruit. And also, of course, people in Koldhiwa also domesticated animals very early on. And in fact, even when the farming settlements didn't grow, a sort of pastoralist society grew around Koldhiwa. So a lot of settlements around the region have been found. So there was an experiment in Koldhiwa, experiment in building an agriculture-based civilization. Now, if the people of Koldhiwa had continued with that experiment, perhaps we would have seen a civilization, in a sense, grow even in eastern India around the same time as it grew in Mehrgarh. So Mehrgarh grew, and it was at the center of exchange between West and East. Ideas and possibly goods flowed in from the Iranian plateau into the Indus River plain. And of course, the most sort of brilliant sort of idea of this age was that you could build a civilization around growing crops. And growing crops allowed you sort of to build a more sophisticated society in which you could develop social differentiation. That means you could develop classes, and you could develop various sort of professions such as artisans, potters, hunters, brickmakers. And this idea caught on. So not very much later, you had other settlements growing around, other agriculture settlements which were also built in this region. So some of these settlements were built not very far from the core of Mehrgarh. So we'll just go through some of these settlements. So just a few hundred miles north, or let's see how many miles north. Just 200 miles north of Mehrgarh, you have another ancient site in Bannu, which is at the village of Sheri Khan Tarakai, which is again built in a pass, in a mountain pass. So again, you see the importance of mountain passes. And this mountain pass, of course, connects the upper reaches of the Indus Valley River with the higher lands of present-day Afghanistan and Badakhshan. And we will see that this region became very important for the Indus Valley civilization, which would grow here a few millennia from now. So in addition to this old settlement of Sheri Khan Tarakai, you had other settlements that grew around the core of Mehrgarh. So moving upward, possibly founded by people who moved up these passes, you had a settlement growing in Dam Sadat. And just watch the pattern here. Then you have another settlement growing in Miri Kalat, not much after. Then you have a settlement growing some miles to the north. Again, let's see how many miles to the north. Mehrgarh. 200 miles north of Mehrgarh at Mundigak, which is in present-day Afghanistan. This again is a very interesting site. Because you see there is a river close by, and this river flows around the edge of a desert. So if you trace the pattern from Mehrgarh up to Dam Sadat and then across this wide plain of about 130 miles, you come to Mundigak. So you see a pattern developing here. So if you were a traveler in those ancient times, if you were traveling up from Mehrgarh, you could rest at Dam Sadat. Then you could make a perilous journey in a sense here across these flatlands to Mundigak. And from Mundigak, you could possibly use this river to come down here and possibly find a route to some site in the Iranian plateau. And this was the ancient center of Shahri Sokhta, which became, in a sense, one of the crucial trading hubs in this wider developing network of exchange. And again, Shahri Sokhta is located not very far away from a fresh water source. The river, of course, flows down, and then you could travel up to Shahri Sokhta and then possibly travel further westward towards Tepe Yahya and further north to the Caspian Sea region. So all these sites have some logic behind them. And this logic, perhaps in the early years, was the logic of trade. Because, of course, these civilizations, these pre-civilizational settlements developing in these harsh zones wouldn't have been settled if there wasn't any sort of utility to be derived from them. So we are moving into a sort of second phase of civilizational development now. Yeah. So now, of course, we are moving to about 5000 BC. So 2000 years have passed, and there are more settlements all around this region. There is more and more trade happening between Mehrgarh, between the Indus Valley regions. Of course, like I mentioned before, these were all pasture lands. So there were people living all around these rivers, around these marshes and pasture lands, and traveling up and down the mountains and down into the plains of the Indus Valley River, River zone. And these people, of course, might have been bringing in resources to trade with the people of Mehrgarh. And these resources were possibly passed further westward. And possibly resources also came from the west to the east. So now gradually, Mehrgarh and this culture growing around Mehrgarh grew into a consolidated culture. So all these sites, you begin to find artifacts which are very similar to each other. In fact, you even begin to find some seals. Seals which we find a lot of seals in the later Indus Valley civilization. We also find a lot of seals in the Mesopotamian civilization. But even around 5000 BC, we begin to find the beginnings of seals, and begin to find these seals all across this arc from Mehrgarh to Mundigak and Miri Kalat. And this culture is now called the Kuli culture. The Kuli culture is named after another site called Kuli, which is not very far away from Mehrgarh. So this, again, is the beginning of the development of a region in a sense. So this even might be the beginning of a civilization, a small regional civilizational core. And now from around 5000 BC, we are entering into what is called the regional phase of prehistory in the development of Indian civilization. This regional base is built around these smaller regional cores. So we have the Kuli culture core, which encompasses this entire arc from Mundigak to Mirikalat and Mehrgarh. We have gradually another core developing around this site further on the Indus River, the site of Koldhiwa. And this again is Koldhiwa is the main site of this culture, of the Koldhiwa regional culture, just like we have the Kuli regional culture to the north. So the Koldhiwa culture is Koldhiwa is the main site, and around Koldhiwa you have the development of various smaller villages, again, which in all of these villages you find similar artifacts as you find in Koldhiwa. So Koldhiwa is the center of this other regional culture that is developing in the Indus Valley Plain. And of course, possibly people from the Indus Valley who were living in this pastoralist lifestyle or just fishing from the waters of the Indus River saw the value of living in a village or living in a settled society, a settled life. So possibly there was some initiative by leaders to make a settlement which could act as another node in this network of trade that was developing in these early years. So Koldhiwa became another important culture. And yet another important culture was the Amri Nal culture, which was further down south from Koldhiwa. So let's just again take our ruler and see the distance. So just about 80 miles south of Koldhiwa, you have another site of Amri Nal. So Amri Nal also developed its own sort of regional cluster. So there was this regional cluster around Koldhiwa with similar artifacts found in smaller villages around Koldhiwa. And you had a regional cluster developing around Amri Nal, with again similar artifacts being found in smaller settlements around Amri Nal. So you see that this zone, this key riverine zone of the Indus Valley, is becoming highly contested. Remember in my presentation on the geopolitics of prehistory, I speak about land, terrain and territory. So as land is being settled and as more and more of these conducive terrains are being fought over, we have more densely packed settlements around them and possibly also some contests over territory. And that will play out in the development of the Indus Valley Civilization. In addition to the Koldhiwa, the Amri Nal, and of course the Kuli culture, we now have another regional cluster developing around the site of Derawar. So this is further up north from Koldhiwa. Again, you see the Indus River region is becoming highly contested, and more settlements, more and more different cultures are settling around. So Derawar is about 160-170 miles north of Koldhiwa. So this is a different kind of culture from Koldhiwa and Amri Nal. And in addition to Derawar, you have some more settlements moving further to the east into this Cholistan region of the Rajasthan region of India. So let's just talk about this region. This is an interesting region for many reasons. So this region, Derawar and Cholistan, if you look at it now, it is a region which is in a dry zone. But this wasn't always so. So just to the north, you see this label defining the Hakra region. The Hakra is a small channel, a river, which flows through this region. And just to the east, you have this label marking the Ghaggar River. The Ghaggar, again, is a small river, which is primarily fed by the rains. Now, this Hakra and Ghaggar region, we know that in prehistoric times, till around 2000 BC, the Ghaggar and the Hakra were one river. So the channel in which these rivers run now were one river of called the Saraswati River in ancient Hindu literature. So this river flowed down from the mountains of the Shivalik hills, from around the Satluj, Beas, just south of the Satluj and the Beas. So it flowed down from there and through the channel into the Indus River. So this was a major river of the region. We know of this from a lot of ancient literature in the Vedas, which are sort of the oldest extant texts that we have from the Indian civilizational corpus. But there is also geological evidence for this Saraswati River, And this geological evidence tells us that around 2000 BC, till around 2000 BC, there was an important river that flowed through this region, and around this river, we have a lot of prominent settlements of these early cultures. So, and there were also lots of excavations in the 1950s and just around the time before the 1950s, which sort of revealed a lot of sites in this region along this arc of what might have been this ancient course of the Saraswati River. So, archaeologists from Pakistan and archaeologists from India found lots of sites in this region, and it was always a puzzle as to why one would find sites here in a region where there was no fresh water and dry land all around. But recent geological data has sort of corroborated the existence of a river in this region. And gradually across millennia, you see a sort of west to east sort of a settlement pattern developing along the course of the ancient Saraswati region. So from Derawar and from Cholistan, across this Hakra region into Ghaggar, and right here into the vicinity of modern day Delhi, you have settlements growing in ancient times. So this is again another regional culture. So regionalization is the focus of this era, and we see more and more regions developing their own clusters. Another very interesting cluster is developing at this time. Of course, I am talking about around 5000, 4000 BC now, in this northern region of the Kashmir Valley. And this is a northern culture known as the Burzahom culture. So this culture is of course centered in a valley, in a mountainous zone. And this is a very different culture from the cultures of the riverine plains. So this culture is primarily focused on hunting, and they have very unique houses and a very unique sort of lifestyle. So the houses are built half underground, and they're primarily focused on hunting, and dogs are a major part of the lives of these Burzahom people. In fact, they're even buried with their dogs. So this is again a very interesting culture developing just to the north of the riverine plains. So of course, now we have moved thousands and thousands of years across archaeological time, from 7000 BC when Mehrgarh was founded, and gradually as the people of the Indus Plains, who were pastoralists and possibly nomads then, as they begin to interact with the people of Mehrgarh and see the value of living in a settled life, they begin to found their own villages from around 5000 to 4000 BC. And then you have the development of these regional cultures, the Amrinal, the Koldhiwa, the Derawar, Cholistan culture. And then, of course, you have the settlement of this small village on the banks of the Ravi River, a village called Harappa. So Harappa was initially founded as a camp. So here we have the development of what is called a camp culture. So camps are essentially places where pastoralists who move their herds from the villages, from settled villages down into the pastoral lands around rivers. So they build these temporary shelters where they can reside for a season, sort of the rainy season. So you build a camp to see through the rainy season, see you through the rainy season, and then move your herds again in the winter. So Harappa was possibly developed as a camp of pastoralists moving down from the high mountains into these regions where other sort of villages were developing. So we spoke of the Cholistan and Derawar region moving eastward, and gradually had another core developing further eastward around the Siswai region. So Harappa was possibly a camp of nomads settled here to sort of link all these regions developing all around this core of the Punjab, the land of the five rivers. So Harappa was a zone where people possibly from the Burzahom culture came southward, from Mehrgarh came eastward, from Amrinal and Koldhiwa came northward, and from Siswai or the Saraswati region came sort of westward, northwestward. So Harappa developed as a camp initially of pastoralists linking all these regions, and gradually developed into a city from around 4000 BC. Now we have a sort of dense packing of different cultures all around this North Indian sort of theater. And now we are ready for moving into the next stage of civilizational development. And the next stage of civilizational development, of course, is the beginning of the Indus Valley Civilization. So initially, scholars spoke of the Indus Valley Civilization as something that began from around 2500 BC. But all these regional cultures that we have uncovered have given us an impression of a more sophisticated picture of the development of civilization in the Indian subcontinent. So of course we already have these densely packed settlements all around the Indus River and various other rivers of the Punjab and also the Saraswati River. In addition to these agriculture civilizations, we have the development of camp cultures in Harappa, and there is another very interesting site just to the south. And this is around the region known as Mehrgarh. So in Harappa, of course, we had a camp where pastoralists lived. In Mehrgarh, we had a different kind of culture, different kind of civilization. This was a civilization primarily focused around a pre-civilizational settlement, primarily focused around hunting, but also the domestication of animals. So hunting and domesticating animals, very similar to kind of culture that might have existed at Koldhiwa. But Mehrgarh is also important because it is very close to another site called Ganeshwara. And Ganeshwara is another site where you find copper or copper mines. So remember, Mehrgarh was settled for copper. So Ganeshwara also is a region where you find copper. So possibly the people of Mehrgarh, or the people who settled around Mehrgarh, or the people who settled around the regions close to Siswai were interacting with people who lived in Ganeshwara. So again, we see the extension of this trading network based around the extraction of minerals, the extraction of core resources, extending further and further inland into the Indian subcontinent and also resulting in the development of settlements. Now, moving this sort of trajectory further, we see the development in the next few millennia, next few generations of yet another culture around the Narmada River Valley. And this is around Hoshangabad. Remember, this was always a region in which lots of people lived since the Stone Age. But now we are moving into the Copper Age or the Chalcolithic Age. So here we have the development of another sort of agriculture-based civilization. And we see the development of civilization almost all across the Indian subcontinent, right from central India to northern India to the Kashmir region. And then, of course, to Mehrgarh, which are the borderlands of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and down into the riverine zone of the Indus River. So this gives us a picture of how civilization developed in the greater sort of Indian subcontinent. And we are still at around 4000 BC. And we have so many cultures and so many cultures developing all around the Indian subcontinent. 4000 to around 3000 BC, we have all these cultures developing here. Now we are moving into a phase which is called the early Harappan era. So the early Harappan era is an era in which lots of cities that we associate with the Indus Valley Civilization are founded. Now there's something very interesting to talk about this transition from this regional phase of civilizations in which these regional cultures develop all around these key zones to the early Harappan culture. And let's just talk about that for a moment. So around 3500 BC, we already have sophisticated cultures everywhere. And these cultures are spreading all around this entire North Indian civilizational arc. But around 3200 BC, something really interesting happens. In Koldhiwa and in a lot of old sites of these entire regional cultures, which have existed now for centuries, for many centuries, we have instances of burning, of fires which burn down entire cities. Now, the reason for these fires is largely unknown. There are conjectures that these fires might have been natural outcomes, but it is odd that natural fires would have sort of broken out in so many settlements around the same time. Then the second conjecture is that it might be the cause of a pestilence or a pandemic, which might have sort of prompted people to burn down old settlements. But the third conjecture is that it might be the consequence of a war, which might have led to the consolidation of the first pan regional civilization, the Indus Valley Civilization. Now, who was behind this war? Whether there was a war, whether there was a consolidation which was led by some great empire builder of the ancient era, we don't know. There are conjectures, like I said, but there is nothing that we know because there was no writing at this point of time and we have no records from this point of time in history. So, now at around 3200 BC, some old settlements at Koldhiwa and some other settlements of these cultures were burnt down. And after this, you had the beginning of a new era in the history of Indian civilization, the beginning of the Indus Valley Civilization. That began with the settlement of key sites which would grow into large cities, such as Kalibangan again on the Saraswati River axis, such as Rakhigari further down. Rakhigari would grow into the largest settlement of the Indus Valley Civilization. Then you had another site of Dholavira in the Gujarat Peninsula. And of course, this Gujarat Peninsula was a much narrower peninsula, like I said earlier. The waters of the Arabian Sea washed much further inland, and Dholavira was possibly founded on an island. So this shows that people from these cultures now had begun to sort of travel by the sea. And Dholavira is about 200 miles south of Amrinal. So this is a long journey and it possibly required some travel by sea. So Dholavira became in a sense the fulcrum of settlement in the larger Gujarat Peninsula. And in addition to Dholavira, another important site of Lothal was founded further south. Lothal also was founded most likely on what was an island during that era. Other important sites founded just south of Dholavira. Somnath, which is a historic temple now, has also revealed signs of an early settlement of these early cultures, early Harappan cultures. Another site is Loteshwar. So in a sense, what we are seeing, first of all, initiative to consolidate these regions into a civilization. And we are also seeing the colonization of this new land of the Gujarat Peninsula by some concerted effort, by some empire builder or some sort of league or senate or however the early cultures of this civilization were politically organized. We are seeing some human initiative here to settle this new land. And of course, there are other regions also in Gujarat which are settled all along the coast, such as a site found near the village of Padari. But interestingly, this extension happens not just southward, but also to the north. And in the north, we have the northernmost settlement of the Indus Valley Civilization, Shortugai, which is about 500 miles north of Harappa. And Shortugai is important. It is important because it is very close to mines of Lapis Lazuli. And Lapis Lazuli, a sort of blue-green gemstone, would become one of the rarest commodities in the ancient world. And Badakhshan, the region where Shortugai is located, is the only region in this Eurasian peninsula where you find Lapis Lazuli. And in a sense, Lapis Lazuli would become a monopoly of the Indus Valley Civilization and would be exported all across these ancient trade routes of these ancient zones, all across the Middle East, into Sumeria, into Mesopotamia, into, of course, the Anatolian Peninsula, where Lapis Lazuli would make its way to Troy, the ancient settlement of Troy, into the Mediterranean world of Mycenae, and of course also into Egyptian civilization, where lapis lazuli would become a rare gemstone and a sign of royalty. Now, why is all this happening? Of course, we see the density of civilization. We see the density of civilization over centuries developing here. And this density was also possibly causing some kind of conflict over land, some kind of conflict over territory, and of course, some kind of conflict over resources. We spoke about the event at around 3200 BC, in which there are some signs that there might have been a possible war and a possible consolidation of civilization. So, this consolidation of civilization is called the beginnings of the Harappan civilization. And because Harappa, which we spoke about as a village which was settled around 4000 BC, Harappa had now grown into a city. And it had grown into a city which had a very sophisticated culture, which is recognizable by various themes in art, various themes in architecture, and also its unique writing, a unique script. And the script was developed in Harappa. We know that because the earliest sort of forms of that script are found in pottery, on shards of pottery at the site of Harappa. So Harappa was where writing was developed. And Harappa was also a nexus, a central core in a sense, which connected all these various regions, which connected the northern region of the Burzahom civilization, which might have given the early Harappans access to lapis lazuli from Shortugai, which connected the Saraswati region, the Siswai region where Rakhi curry was growing into a large settlement, which connected the Ganeshwara region from where copper was extracted, and on the route between Ganeshwara and Harappa, the site of Kalibangan was founded, which connected Cholistan and Deravar, the old sites from where the expansion into the Saraswati river course began, and which also connected, in a sense, the southern and the older cultures of Koldhiwa and Amrinal, and of course also the still older cultures of Mehrgarh and Sheri Khan Tarakai in Bannu. So Harappa was this center and this core, and it's not for any other reason that Harappa is seen as the capital of what would become the Indus Valley Civilization. And the Indus Valley Civilization, in fact, is known now as the Harappan Civilization, because you find these artifacts and this culture of Harappa, in a sense, becoming the dominant theme of all the cultures in this entire region, from Mundigak to Somnath to Padari, also touching on perhaps Bagor and Ganeshwara, and of course still Rakhi Gadi. But to sort of show their dominance over the entire region, the Harappans possibly founded another city which became the southern capital of the Indus Valley Civilization, and this was Mohenjo-daro. Mohenjo-daro was founded not far away from the old site of Koldhiwa. Of course, the old site of Koldhiwa was destroyed, and Mohenjo-daro might have been founded as Harappans as a new imperial capital in the southern sort of reaches of their empire, and which might have been a trading empire at that time. And the trading empire continued to expand, because not much later another site was founded, which was the westernmost site of the Indus Valley Civilization, and this was the site of Sutkan Kagendor. Sutkagendor, again, so much mispronunciation. Yeah, so this was founded on the coast of the Arabian Sea, and just linking the Straits of Hormuz of the Persian Gulf with the Arabian Sea. So of course this became an important trading site. And very interestingly, Sut Kagendor was a fortified site, so it had walls all around. So again, there are hints that it might have been founded in a zone where the native population around it might have been hostile. So this Indus Valley Civilization around 3500 BC was coming into its own. And lots of these old sites had been founded, and Harappan culture was becoming the dominant culture in most of these old sites. And of course, at around 3000 BC, Just after 3000 BC, around 2800 BC, Mohenjo-daro was founded. And the founding of Mohenjo-daro, in a sense, was the beginning of the mature Harappan age, or the high age of the Indus Valley Civilization, which is something that we will explore in the next presentation.